On the night of March 9th, 1945, the people of Tokyo went to sleep under a clear sky. Air raid sirens had become routine by then. High-altitude B-29s had bombed the city before, often inaccurately, their bombs scattered by jet stream winds over factories and empty lots. Many believed this night would be no different. They were wrong. Over the Pacific, more than 300 B-29 Superfortresses were already in the air, launched from bases in the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. The distance to Tokyo was roughly 1,500 miles. Each bomber carried a new kind of payload, clusters of M69 incendiary bomblets, small napalm-filled tubes designed not to explode with a single blast, but to ignite thousands of separate fires. The mission had a name: Operation Meetinghouse. This time, the bombers were not flying at 30,000 feet. They were coming in low, between 5,000 and 8,000 feet. The decision had been made by Major General Curtis LeMay, who concluded that high-altitude precision bombing simply was not working over Japan. Cloud cover, high winds, and dispersed cottage industries made accurate targeting nearly impossible. Tokyo's war production was not concentrated in massive steel complexes. It was woven into neighborhoods, small workshops, family homes, wooden structures packed tightly together. If industry was embedded in the city, then the city itself became the target. Shortly after midnight, the first Pathfinder aircraft arrived over Tokyo. They marked an X on the densely populated Shitamachi district in eastern Tokyo, an area filled with wooden homes, narrow streets, and small factories. At approximately 12:15 a.m., the first incendiaries began to fall. The M69s didn't detonate like conventional bombs. They punched through roofs and walls, delayed for a few seconds, then erupted into streams of burning gel. Each cluster bomb released dozens of these small bomblets. One B-29 could scatter hundreds of separate fires across several city blocks. Multiply that by more than 300 aircraft, and the effect was exponential. Within minutes, fires were spreading faster than the city's firefighting capabilities could respond. Tokyo's buildings were largely constructed of wood and paper. The winter air was dry. A moderate wind began to fan the flames. Separate fires merged into larger blazes merged into walls of flame. By 1 a.m., entire districts were burning. The heat intensified rapidly. Temperatures in the fire zones would later be estimated at over 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit in some areas. The rising columns of hot air created their own wind systems. Oxygen was pulled inward at ground level, generating hurricane-force gusts that fed the inferno. This was no longer a collection of fires. It was a firestorm. Survivors later described the sound as a continuous roar, like 1,000 furnaces combined. Asphalt softened and stuck to shoes. People fled toward canals and rivers, seeking water as protection from the heat. Many never made it. Others crowded into the Sumida River, only to find that the air above the water was still superheated, thick with smoke and ash. In the sky above, the B-29 crews could see the city transforming into a single glowing mass. Pilots reported turbulence from the updrafts generated by the flames. Some aircraft were lifted hundreds of feet by the rising heat. The target was impossible to miss. The glow could be seen from over 150 miles away. Tokyo's air defenses struggled to respond. Anti-aircraft guns were calibrated for high-altitude bombers, not low-level night attacks. Radar coverage was limited and often unreliable. Japan's fighter force had been severely weakened by 1945. Fuel shortages restricted pilot training and flight hours. Many experienced aviators had already been lost in earlier campaigns in the Pacific. Those who did take off that night faced difficulties locating the bombers in darkness and smoke, and the B-29 formations were dispersed, not flying in tight, predictable groups. Some Japanese fighters did intercept, and several B-29s were shot down, but the scale of the raid overwhelmed the defense. More than 300 bombers dropping incendiaries across a concentrated urban area created a problem that could not be solved tactically. It was a matter of capacity. Japan no longer had the industrial depth, fuel reserves, or trained personnel to counter such sustained attacks. On the ground, civil defense systems collapsed under the sheer magnitude of the disaster. Fire breaks that had been prepared proved insufficient. Water pressure failed in many districts as pipes ruptured or were drained. Communication lines were severed. Evacuation routes became choke points. Families were separated in the darkness and smoke. By 2:30 a.m., the firestorm was at its peak. Winds generated by the inferno reportedly reached speeds of 50 to 60 miles per hour in some sectors. The flames advanced in walls, consuming entire blocks in minutes. Shelters designed to protect against conventional bombing offered little defense against suffocation or extreme heat. By dawn, the worst was over. The bombers turned back to the Marianas. Behind them, Tokyo smoldered. Approximately 15.8 square miles of the city had been destroyed. Estimates of the dead vary, but modern historical research places the number of fatalities around 100,000 people killed in a single night. Over 1 million were left homeless. It was the most destructive conventional air raid in history. For Japanese leaders, the implications were profound. This was not a limited strike on a factory complex. It was the systematic destruction of the capital's industrial and residential core. The scale of American production had made such an operation possible. Hundreds of long-range bombers, thousands of tons of incendiaries, and the logistical chain to repeat it again and again. Tokyo had faced earthquakes before. It had rebuilt after the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923. But this destruction was different. It came not from nature, but from an adversary whose factories were operating at a scale Japan could not match. In a single night, the illusion that distance could protect the home islands was shattered. The Pacific Ocean was no longer a barrier. It was a runway. Operation Meetinghouse demonstrated something beyond tactical innovation. It revealed the arithmetic of modern war. When one side can send 300 bombers across 1,500 miles, absorb losses, and prepare to do it again within days, while the other struggles to launch a handful of interceptors, the outcome is no longer determined solely by courage or strategy. It is determined by capacity. As the sun rose over Tokyo on March 10, 1945, smoke columns drifted into the morning sky. Entire neighborhoods had vanished, infrastructure was crippled, civilian morale was shaken, and within Japan's leadership circles, an unspoken realization began to form. If this could happen once, it could happen again, and there was very little left that could stop it.
In early 1945, the United States possessed a machine unlike anything the world had ever seen. Not just a bomber, but an entire industrial system built to sustain it. The B-29 Superfortress was one of the most complex aircraft of the war. Pressurized cabins, remote-controlled gun turrets, advanced fire control systems, and a range of over 3,000 miles. It was expensive, difficult to build, and initially plagued with technical problems, especially engine fires. Yet the United States did something no other nation could do at that stage of the war. It fixed the problems and kept building. By 1944 and into 1945, American factories were producing B-29s at a rate Japan could not comprehend. Boeing's massive plant in Wichita, along with facilities operated by Bell and Martin, turned out aircraft in numbers that transformed the Pacific War. Each bomber required vast quantities of aluminum, steel, rubber, copper, wiring, engines, instruments, an entire ecosystem of suppliers stretching across the continental United States. The program cost billions of dollars, rivaled only by the Manhattan Project in scale and secrecy. But the airplane itself was only one part of the equation. Each B-29 required an 11-man crew: pilots, navigators, bombardiers, flight engineers, radio operators, gunners. Training them demanded fuel, flight hours, instructors, and airfields. The United States had all of it. By 1945, American training bases were producing thousands of aircrew every month. If a bomber was lost, another rolled off the assembly line. If a crew was lost, replacements were already in the pipeline. Japan could not replicate this cycle. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan required more than aircraft and crews. It required geography. After brutal campaigns across the Pacific, the United States seized the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in 1944. These islands were not symbolic prizes. They were runways within range of Tokyo. Engineers from the U.S. Navy's construction battalions, the Seabees, transformed coral and jungle into some of the largest air bases in the world. On Tinian alone, North Field became one of the busiest airfields on Earth, with runways stretching thousands of feet, capable of launching hundreds of heavy bombers in a single night. Fuel had to travel thousands of miles by tanker across submarine-infested waters. Spare parts, bombs, food, ammunition, everything had to cross the Pacific, and it did. American shipyards were producing Liberty and Victory ships faster than German U-boats could sink them. Oil flowed from Texas and California. Refineries operated around the clock. Railroads moved materials coast to coast without interruption from enemy bombing. The United States was fighting a global war on two major fronts, yet still expanding output. By contrast, Japan's industrial base was constrained by limited natural resources. The empire relied heavily on imported oil, much of it from the Dutch East Indies. American submarines systematically targeted Japanese merchant shipping, sinking tankers and cargo vessels at a pace that Japan could not replace. By 1945, fuel shortages were severe. Pilot training hours were cut drastically. Aircraft production struggled not only from bombing, but from lack of raw materials. Even when Japan produced aircraft, it faced a deeper problem: attrition. In 1942, Japanese naval aviators had been among the most experienced in the world, but battles like Midway and the Long Campaign in the Solomons consumed irreplaceable veterans. The United States, meanwhile, rotated pilots through training programs that emphasized standardization and scale. Quality mattered, but quantity ensured sustainability. A downed American aircraft was a loss. A downed Japanese aircraft was often irreplaceable. The B-29 campaign illustrated this imbalance with brutal clarity. When General Curtis LeMay shifted to low-altitude incendiary raids in early 1945, he did so knowing he could absorb losses. The American industrial system could replace bombers faster than Japan could shoot them down. The calculus was cold but simple. Even if several B-29s were destroyed per raid, the overall force would grow, not shrink. And it did. In the months following the Tokyo firebombing, American bombers returned repeatedly. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, major urban and industrial centers were devastated. The cumulative destruction was staggering. Entire sections of cities disappeared under waves of incendiaries. Japanese industry, much of it dispersed in small workshops embedded within urban neighborhoods, was systematically dismantled. The psychological impact was profound, but the material impact was even greater. Steel production declined, transportation networks faltered, electricity grids were damaged, civilian displacement disrupted labor forces. Every destroyed block was not just housing, it was tools, machines, and human capital. Meanwhile, American shipyards launched aircraft carriers, destroyers, and submarines at rates that defied pre-war imagination. The Essex-class carriers entered service in numbers that overwhelmed Japanese naval planning. Each carrier brought dozens of aircraft. Each aircraft required engines, munitions, spare parts, all supplied by a continent-sized economy operating at full throttle. The scale was mathematical. By 1945, the United States had produced nearly 300,000 aircraft during the war. Japan's total output was a fraction of that. American aluminum production alone dwarfed Japan's entire industrial capacity in several sectors. The imbalance extended beyond planes to trucks, tanks, artillery, and merchant ships. War had become a contest of systems, not isolated battles. For Japanese leadership, this presented an unsolvable equation. Even heroic resistance could not compensate for the widening production gap. Even tactical victories could not offset strategic attrition. Every month the war continued, the disparity grew larger. Operation Meetinghouse was not just a devastating air raid, it was proof of concept. If 300 bombers could incinerate 15 square miles in a single night, and if those bombers could be replaced, refueled, and relaunched within days, then the defense of the home islands faced a relentless cycle. Factories in America were not threatened by bombing. They operated in safety, separated by oceans from enemy attack. Workers labored without fear of air raids. Assembly lines improved efficiency month after month. Industrial output became predictable, scalable, unstoppable. Japan's factories, by contrast, were increasingly within reach. Raw materials were scarce. Transportation was disrupted. Skilled labor was diverted to the front or killed in action. The strategic initiative had shifted completely. Modern war had revealed its core principle: logistics determined destiny. It was no longer a question of bravery or sacrifice. It was a question of throughput. How many aircraft per month? How many trained crews? How much fuel? How many replacement parts? On every line of that ledger, the numbers favored the United States by an expanding margin. The B-29 was the visible symbol in the sky, but behind each bomber flew steel mills in Pennsylvania, oil fields in Texas, assembly plants in Kansas, shipyards in California, and training bases across the American Midwest. An entire civilization had been mobilized into synchronized production. For Japan, the realization was gradual but inescapable. The enemy was not just approaching from the horizon, it was operating from an industrial base beyond reach, beyond retaliation, beyond exhaustion. And as long as that machine kept running, the sky over Japan would never truly be empty again.
By the beginning of 1945, Japan was fighting a war it no longer had the resources to sustain. The empire that had once expanded across East Asia and the Pacific now faced a tightening ring of steel, fire, and blockade. What had begun in 1941 as a gamble for strategic self-sufficiency had become a slow mathematical collapse. The roots of the crisis stretched back years earlier. Japan entered the war heavily dependent on imported oil. Domestic production met only a small fraction of its needs. Before Pearl Harbor, much of its petroleum came from the United States. When American embargoes cut off that supply in 1941, Japanese planners faced a stark reality. Without oil, their navy would sit idle, their aircraft grounded, their industry stalled. The decision to move south into Southeast Asia and the Dutch East Indies was not just expansion, it was desperation for fuel. At first, the gamble appeared to work. Japanese forces captured oil fields and resource-rich territories. But conquest was only the first step. Protecting sea lanes across thousands of miles of ocean proved far more difficult. American submarines began a relentless campaign against Japanese shipping. Tankers carrying oil from the East Indies became prime targets. Cargo ships transporting raw materials were sunk faster than Japan could replace them. By 1944, the merchant fleet was shrinking dramatically. By 1945, fuel shortages were crippling. Pilot training programs were slashed. Where Japanese aviators once trained extensively, accumulating hundreds of flight hours before combat, new pilots received drastically reduced instruction. Some entered battle with only a fraction of the experience their predecessors had in 1941. Aircraft could not fly without fuel. Training aircraft sat idle. Combat units rationed sorties. The consequences had already been visible in earlier battles. At Midway in 1942, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers and many of its most experienced aviators. In the long attritional struggle over the Solomon Islands, particularly around Guadalcanal, the Imperial Navy and Army Air Forces bled away irreplaceable veterans. Unlike the United States, Japan lacked a vast training infrastructure capable of rapidly expanding and standardizing pilot production. Each experienced loss compounded over time. By the time American B-29s began systematic bombing of the home islands, Japan's air defense network was a shadow of what it had once been. Radar coverage was limited and often outdated. Fighter aircraft were available in smaller numbers, and many were technically inferior at high altitudes. Anti-aircraft ammunition was finite. Replacement parts were scarce. Fuel shortages meant that interceptors could not scramble against every raid. Decisions had to be made, what to defend and what to sacrifice. Tokyo faced an uncomfortable truth. It could not defend everything. Compounding the problem was the structure of Japanese industry itself. Unlike the massive centralized industrial complexes of the United States, much of Japan's war production was dispersed into small workshops embedded within urban neighborhoods. Families assembled components in their homes. Small factories produced parts for aircraft, munitions, and machinery. This system had advantages earlier in the war, making it harder for enemy intelligence to identify single, decisive targets. But once area bombing began, that dispersion became vulnerability. When incendiaries fell on Tokyo, they did not simply destroy houses. They destroyed tools, machines, skilled laborers, supply chains, and transportation nodes all at once. Every burned district represented dozens of microfactories erased in a single night. Reconstruction required materials that were already scarce. Meanwhile, American forces captured island after island, pushing closer to the Japanese mainland. The fall of Saipan in 1944 was particularly devastating psychologically. It brought the home islands within direct bomber range. For the first time, Japan's leadership confronted the prospect of sustained attacks on its own cities. Inside government and military circles, debates intensified. Some argued for decisive battle, drawing the U.S. Navy into a climactic confrontation that might force negotiation. Others believed that inflicting massive casualties during an eventual invasion could compel better surrender terms. But underlying these strategic discussions was a quieter recognition. The material balance was deteriorating rapidly. Steel production declined as shipping losses restricted imports of iron ore and coal. Rail networks suffered from lack of maintenance and bombing damage. Electrical power generation faltered. Even food supplies became strained, contributing to declining civilian morale. The Japanese military had long emphasized spirit, discipline, and sacrifice. These values remained strong, but industrial warfare demanded more than morale. It demanded output, continuous, scalable, replaceable output. When American carrier task forces approached Japanese waters in 1945, they did so backed by a logistical chain stretching across the Pacific. Oilers refueled ships at sea, floating dry docks repaired damaged vessels, replacement aircraft arrived in steady streams. Japanese planners understood what this meant. Even if they sank ships or shot down planes, the overall American capacity would remain intact. Japan could inflict pain, it could not reverse the trend. The introduction of organized kamikaze attacks in late 1944 and 1945 reflected this strategic bind. If conventional air power could not match American production, then pilots themselves would become weapons. It was a measure born not of early war confidence, but of late war constraint. Sacrifice replaced sustainability. By the spring of 1945, the homeland stood increasingly exposed. Okinawa would soon become the site of one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific, bringing American forces within 400 miles of Kyushu. B-29 raids intensified, targeting not only cities but transportation networks, aircraft factories, and industrial centers. Each raid compounded the strain. Inside Japanese leadership, realization did not come as a single dramatic moment. It emerged gradually, through reports, statistics, and shortages. Fewer aircraft operational, less fuel available, more districts destroyed, civil defense overwhelmed, production targets missed month after month. The war was no longer about capturing territory, it was about endurance under bombardment. And endurance required resources Japan no longer possessed in sufficient quantity. The strategic trap had closed. The initial expansion that was meant to secure oil and materials had triggered a conflict against an industrial power of continental scale. The longer the war lasted, the greater the disparity became. Time, once an ally during early conquests, had turned into an adversary. By March 1945, when Tokyo burned under Operation Meetinghouse, it was not an isolated event. It was the visible symptom of a deeper imbalance, one that had been widening for years. Japan entered the war seeking strategic independence. It now faced strategic exhaustion.
War in the 20th century was no longer decided only by generals or by courage on the battlefield. It was decided by arithmetic. By 1945, the Pacific War had become a contest of numbers so large that individual battles, however dramatic, were only fragments of a much bigger equation. The bombing of Tokyo was not just an act of destruction, it was a data point in a system that measured output, replacement, and attrition. Start with aircraft production. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States produced nearly 300,000 military aircraft of all types. In 1944 alone, American factories built close to 100,000 planes. Japan, over the entire war, produced a fraction of that number. Even at its peak output, Japan could not match the sustained volume of American industry. Now, narrow that to heavy bombers. The B-29 program was one of the most complex and expensive undertakings of the war. Yet by 1945, hundreds were operational in the Pacific. More were arriving each month. If 10 were lost in combat or accidents, 20 could replace them. The curve moved upward, not downward. That is the essence of industrial warfare, the ability to replace losses faster than the enemy can inflict them. The same imbalance appeared at sea. American shipyards launched aircraft carriers, destroyers, submarines, and cargo ships at staggering rates. The Essex-class fleet carriers alone entered service in numbers that reshaped naval strategy. Each new carrier brought with it dozens of aircraft, hundreds of crew, and a floating airfield capable of projecting power hundreds of miles. Japan, by contrast, struggled to replace major warships lost in battles like Midway and the Philippine Sea. Shipbuilding required steel, skilled labor, engines, electronics, and above all, fuel to operate the finished vessels. As American submarines sank merchant shipping, Japan's access to raw materials tightened. Every new ship became harder to complete and even harder to supply. Then there was oil, the bloodstream of modern war. The United States was one of the world's largest oil producers. Tankers moved fuel freely between refineries and ports. Naval task forces could refuel at sea, extending their operational reach indefinitely. Aircraft training programs consumed enormous amounts of gasoline, and it was available in abundance. Japan's oil situation deteriorated steadily after 1943. Submarine warfare cut tanker routes, stockpiles shrank, training hours were reduced to conserve fuel, pilots entered combat with less experience, warships remained in port for lack of operational reserves. Even when aircraft were available, they could not always fly. These numbers translated directly into strategic flexibility. When American planners prepared a bombing campaign, they could calculate acceptable losses. If a certain percentage of bombers failed to return, the overall force would remain sustainable. Replacement crews were in training, replacement aircraft were in assembly, replacement engines were already being machined. For Japan, every loss weighed heavier. A veteran pilot shot down over the Pacific was not just an individual tragedy, it was a depletion of a shrinking pool of expertise. A factory destroyed by bombing was not easily rebuilt when steel and machinery were scarce. A cargo ship sunk at sea was not quickly replaced when shipyards were under strain. Attrition favored the side with deeper reserves. This is what made the firebombing of Tokyo more than a tactical innovation. It demonstrated that the United States could project overwhelming force repeatedly, not as a one-time blow, but as a sustained pattern. 300 bombers one night, 200 the next, another wave days later. The mathematics were relentless. Imagine two opposing systems. One produces 1,000 units per month and loses 100. The other produces 200 units per month and loses 100. Even if both lose the same amount, the trajectories diverge dramatically. One expands, the other contracts. By 1945, the Pacific War had entered that phase of divergence. American aircraft production outpaced losses by wide margins. Shipbuilding replaced and expanded fleets simultaneously. Training pipelines ensured a constant influx of personnel. Industrial plants operated largely beyond the reach of enemy bombing. The continental United States functioned as a secure production platform. Japan, by contrast, faced shrinking inputs and increasing outputs of destruction. Bombing reduced industrial capacity. Submarine warfare reduced imports. Fuel shortages reduced training. Reduced training lowered combat effectiveness, which increased losses, which further strained production. It was a feedback loop moving in the wrong direction. Even the geography reinforced the imbalance. American bombers operated from island bases that were steadily expanding. Engineers built longer runways, larger depots, greater storage facilities. Ships crossed the Pacific under heavy escort. The logistical network grew stronger with time. Japan's network grew weaker. Rail lines were damaged by bombing. Ports were mined. Coastal shipping faced constant threat. Communication systems degraded. The very infrastructure needed to coordinate national defense eroded under pressure. The leadership in Tokyo could still plan operations, they could still deploy forces, but the underlying data told a harsher story.
Production targets missed, replacement aircraft delayed, fuel allocations cut, ammunition stocks dwindling. Modern war had become an equation of throughput. How many tons of bombs delivered per month? How many aircraft engines produced per week? How many trained crews available per sortie? When plotted over time, these figures formed lines on a graph. By early 1945, those lines were no longer intersecting. They were separating. The bombing of Tokyo was decisive because it destroyed 15.8 square miles in one night. It was decisive because it proved that such destruction could be repeated, and that the side inflicting it had the industrial stamina to continue indefinitely. Courage could influence a battle, strategy could influence a campaign, but when the material gap reached a certain threshold, outcome became less about possibility and more about probability. The mathematics of modern war are brutal precisely because they are indifferent. They measure not honor or sacrifice, they measure capacity. And by the spring of 1945, the Pacific capacity gap was no longer narrowing, it was widening.
By the spring of 1945, the destruction of Tokyo was no longer a hypothetical threat. It was a memory, smoke-stained, measured in square miles, counted in tens of thousands of dead. Operation Meetinghouse had shown what American air power could do in a single night. But inside Japan's leadership circles, the deeper shock was not emotional, it was strategic. They understood this could continue. In the weeks after March 10th, reports flowed into Tokyo from prefectural officials, military commanders, and industrial ministries. Entire wards reduced to ash, hundreds of thousands homeless, transportation lines disrupted, small factories, many tied to aircraft and munitions production, simply gone. Civil defense units overwhelmed. This was not an isolated disaster like an earthquake. It was a man-made process, repeatable at will. American B-29s returned again and again. Nagoya burned, Osaka burned, Kobe burned. Each raid followed a similar pattern. Incendiaries dropped at low altitude, fires merging into infernos, urban industry collapsing block by block. By the summer of 1945, dozens of Japanese cities had suffered extensive damage. The cumulative effect was staggering. Within the Supreme War Council, debates grew sharper. Some leaders argued that Japan must fight on, inflict maximum casualties in any invasion, and hope to negotiate more favorable terms. Others quietly acknowledged the deteriorating position. But even those advocating continued resistance could not ignore the data. Aircraft production was falling, despite desperate efforts to disperse manufacturing into rural areas and underground facilities. Fuel stocks were critically low. Naval units were immobilized. Pilot training was minimal. Anti-aircraft defenses struggled to protect every target. The strategic picture was narrowing. Okinawa fell in June 1945 after one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific. Its capture brought American forces within striking distance of the Japanese mainland. The prospect of invasion, Operation Downfall, loomed. Japanese planners prepared for a final defense of the home islands, mobilizing civilians, stockpiling whatever weapons remained. Yet above all of this hung the relentless presence of the bombers. Each air raid reinforced a reality that could no longer be concealed. Americans possessed the ability to destroy Japan's urban industrial base faster than Japan could repair or replace it. The skies were no longer contested in any meaningful sense. They were corridors. The psychological impact on civilians was immense. Night after night, sirens wailed. Families evacuated to the countryside when possible. Children were relocated. Makeshift shelters filled. But confidence in protection eroded. The state could urge endurance and sacrifice, yet it could not promise safety. Inside the military establishment, the language remained resolute. Official communications emphasized honor, resistance, and decisive battle. But private diaries and post-war testimonies reveal something more complex, a growing awareness that the war's material balance had tipped irreversibly. The firebombing campaign alone had already killed more civilians than many single battles, and still American production lines operated without interruption. New B-29s rolled out, new crews trained, new bombs loaded. Then, in August 1945, a new and unprecedented weapon was introduced: Hiroshima, Nagasaki. The atomic bombings overshadowed the earlier fire raids in both scale and symbolism. Yet it is crucial to understand the context. By the time the atomic bombs fell, Japan's cities were already shattered, its industry degraded, its transportation strained. The atomic bomb was a shock of a different order, but it landed on a nation already exhausted by conventional destruction. When Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation on August 15th, announcing Japan's surrender, he referenced the new and most cruel bomb. But the decision emerged from cumulative pressures: naval blockade, Soviet entry into the war, and months of strategic bombing that had demonstrated the inability to defend the homeland effectively. The realization had not come in a single dramatic meeting. It had formed over time, through statistics, shortages, and burning skylines. Tokyo's destruction on March 9th to 10th, 1945 marked a turning point in perception. It showed that no district was immune, no concentration of population too dense to be spared, no night too dark to shield the city. It demonstrated that American industry could project power directly into the heart of the empire. Once that understanding took hold, the question was no longer if Japan could win, it was how much more it could endure. Modern total war had exposed its final lesson. When one side achieves overwhelming industrial superiority, the battlefield expands to encompass entire societies. Factories become targets, neighborhoods become production nodes, civilians become casualties of capacity. For Japan's leaders, the view upward toward formations of bombers that could not be fully intercepted, could not be outproduced, could not be deterred, forced a reckoning. The war was decided long before the final announcement. Not solely in the skies over Tokyo, not solely in the waters off Okinawa, but in the steel mills, oil fields, assembly plants, and training bases thousands of miles away, where output charts rose month after month, and where the arithmetic of modern war quietly sealed the outcome. By the time surrender came, the mathematics were undeniable. The sky had delivered the message, and the factories had written it.